What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this past weekend we saw the World Team Championship go down, the Olympics of Warhammer, as it were, taking place in Mechelen, Belgium, and it was won by none other than France. So today what we're going to be doing is breaking down the winning armies from the French WTC team. We're going to be talking about some of the strategies that WTC teams use in order to compete in the format and how exactly the WTC format works. So let's dive in. Now, for those who don't know, the WTC is an international team competition. It allows one team from each nation to attend, with some exceptions. Each country provides a team of 8 players. Each round 2 teams are paired, and each of those teams will pair their 8 players together in a series of 1v1 games to determine the team victor of that round. This year's WTC boasted 40 teams attending and took place over 7 rounds of Warhammer 40k. Now, a big part of the strategy to compete at the WTC is the team pairing and scoring process. During this pairing process, each team selects defenders to present to the other team. This means they pick one player from their team to put up that the other team is going to be pairing against. The other team then selects 2 attackers to be paired against that defender, and the defending team chooses one of the attackers that they would rather play. There's then a table selection process. Each table terrain layout is slightly different. Some of them are much lighter on terrain and better for ranged armies. Some are heavier on terrain and better for more melee centric or more maneuverable armies. So the terrain on the table is actually important in the matchup process as well. That will continue on until the final pair of matches gets locked in, because they're the only armies remaining. This allows teams to potentially pin enemies into specific matchups that they want, either by drawing them out as a defender early or by forcing them through to the end of the pairing process and forcing them to play a specific matchup in those final pairings. Those are called the fall through pairings. Now, the result of each game and the result of the final match actually is not calculated based on the wins of these players. Whether you win or lose your game in a WTC matchup process doesn't matter at all. Instead, the event uses what's called differential scoring. In this system, the result on each game is calculated based on the differential between the 2 players' scores. Essentially, if the 2 final victory point scores are within 50 points of each other, the difference between them in increments of 5, with a couple of exceptions, will be traded back and forth out of 20 points. So, for example, if both players are within 5 points of each other, both of them will score 10 of those possible 20. However, if one player is up 25 points on the other player, that player is instead going to be getting 15 points and the other player is only going to be getting 5. The winner of the round is based on the team with the most of those differential points. Now, this might sound like it's a little bit of a complicated system, but the reason that it works this way is so that some armies who are not as good at securing wins, but are good at securing raw victory points, can actually be used to defend against particularly strong armies. So, for example, if you have an army that can deal insane damage and table your opponent with no problem, what a team can try to do is pair them into an army that doesn't care about losing casualties, but is excellent at scoring. Armies that are highly maneuverable, that can jump around the table, 3-edge deep strike, reposition themselves, are excellent in this format because they're going to be able to achieve a high score essentially regardless of what their opponent's doing. These armies are often used either as defending armies because they can be put forward and almost regardless of the matchup, they can be assured that worst case scenario, they'll only lose by a couple points, and even if the other team puts a particularly scary or dangerous army against them, you can essentially blank the matchup by making it effectively a draw. Oftentimes there are armies that are better or worse in a format at that. This year's WTC had a large representation of armies like Necrons and Grey Knights. Necrons using Hypercrypt Legion to reposition themselves around the table. Grey Knights for their teleport strike, essentially the same deal. And Team France used both of these factions, as well as a couple other relatively high scoring factions. This also means that individual player record doesn't actually matter for these events. You don't have to win all your games, you simply have to score points from your opponent. And the other component of the strategy is getting the real hammer blow armies that are very good in specific matchups or are good at dealing insane damage to their opponents, into matchups where they can flex that insane power. And then you can start to get 20-0 victories for your team. So if the pairing process goes well, your opponent's toughest armies are going to probably get somewhere around draws. Maybe they'll win 11-9 against your high scoring armies, whereas your hammer armies can score 20-0 3-0 against the other team's weaker options. That gives you the best chance at scoring the most differential points for that round and actually securing the win for the team. You can essentially hammer and anvil out your team composition. You have the anvil of these high-scoring armies that can kind of just bulwark against super scary enemies versus the hammer of these highly aggressive armies that can score these huge wins. So that's a breakdown of the format and the strategies used to win. Let's talk about exactly how France did it. They essentially had a breakdown on their team. 4 of their players were focused on blanking those high-scoring matchups. These players usually got somewhere around a draw in most of their games. If they did take a loss, which is fine in the team format, it was not a big loss, so they did not give up many points for their team, and they took what the other team might have been expecting to be a big win for them and were able to bring it back to a more favorable result for France. Each team is also allowed a team captain. They're not a playing member of the team, but they do govern the pairing process, and they're actually allowed to go between games during the round and update their players on the scores of other completed games. They are not allowed to give in-game advice to players, and while they can coach players before the game begins, once the game starts, players are responsible for all of the onboard decision-making themselves. But what they can do is they can inform player strategies based on the current team scoring. If a game didn't go your team's way, the captain can come over to a teammate, inform them of the result of that game, and tell them that maybe they need to try to score some higher points because the team isn't looking as good in this round so far as their projections might have estimated. The team captain for this year's French team was Raphael Dumas. So with that, let's talk about the lists that each of these players took to the event. We'll start with these high-scoring kind of anvil factions. Hugo Richiardi was on Aeldari, running a Ynnari build led by Yvraine, who was in fact the only Craft World character in the list. However, she was the warlord, so she did unlock the ability to take Drukhari units as well. The army included a large Harlequin troop, an 11-player Harlequin troop for Yvraine to jump into, as well as a Wave Serpent to carry those to the table. Yvraine makes the unit much harder to kill. She gives them a field of pain and can regenerate models back to the unit. She also has a pretty good psychic attack and a strong melee attack, especially when combined with the Harlequin troops +1 to wound on the charge. So she and the Harlequins together make a pretty good melee counterpunch for the army. From there, we included an MSU of a ton of small Eldar units. This included 3 units of Dark Reapers, 5 Dark Reapers apiece with Tempest launchers to give them some indirect fire. This means that this army is incredibly good against other high-scoring armies. Those armies tend to take lots of these small, lightly armored units that you can scatter around the table, score objectives with, and complete secondaries with, and having 3 Tempest launchers on the table allows you to pick those units up extremely quickly. So that can also throw another wrench in the work of the pairing process because this Eldar list is highly disincentivized from putting opponents' high-scoring lists into it because it is good at answering them. We also saw a unit of Howling Banshees, 2 units of Striking Scorpions for some forward operation to block enemy infiltrators, 2 units of Swooping Hawks for their ability to reposition, and 2 Warp Spider units for utility and their devastating wounded Death Spitters. From the allied contingent, we also saw 3 units of Scourges. These had a combination of Dark Lances and Haywire Blasters. It's pretty common to see nowadays in these Ynnari builds. The big benefit that Ynnari has over Drukhari is that you get access to the Battle Host stratagems and abilities. So the Battle Host attachment ability gives all Aeldari units a hit and wound reroll every time they combat activate, even if you are Drukhari unit. As long as you have the Aeldari keyword, you get that benefit. The downside is that Scourges are usually included with pain tokens in mind, with their power from pain ability, which gives them full hit rerolls. The single hit reroll, not as good as the full hit rerolls, so what these units are taking is 4 Haywire Blasters for the higher volume attacks that don't necessarily need the rerolls, and a single Dark Lance, which can then make use of the Battle Host reroll. These Haywire Blasters give the army a good baseline of damage against enemy vehicle skews because they have that anti-vehicle devastating damage, and the Dark Lances can allow them to deal higher impact damage against a wider variety of targets. We also saw a Venom alongside a unit of Kabalite Warriors to split inside that Venom. Venoms also have a little bit of internal synergy with Eldar thanks to Bladestorm, Venoms with their Splinter Cannons, and the Embarked Kabalite Warriors with Splinter Rifles and Splinter Cannons have a strong anti-infantry value, which scores them critical wounds on usually a 3+, and Bladestorm can give them additional AP when scoring critical wounds. So you can fire into a medium infantry unit like Space Marines, you have up to 9 Splinter Cannon shots plus sustained hits plus Splinter Rifle attacks. All of those wound on 3s, and all of those 3s get plus 2 AP if you use that stratagem. So these guys are actually extremely good at clearing out 2-ish wound infantry and are a good utility unit. We then also had a unit of 10 witches alongside Lilith Hesperax to act as another melee counterpunch, although they did not have a transport to go into unless we were embarking them inside the Venom, but I think the Venom was probably taking those Cavalite warriors. Now, as I mentioned before, that high volume allows the Aeldari to spread all the way around the table. You have locking objectives thanks to the Cavalite warriors, even inside the Venom, and you have tons and tons of extremely fast units that can reposition around the table very quickly, either using things like the Scourges that can deep strike, shoot, and then move, the Warp Spiders that can use their flicker jump to move up to 24 inches, and the Swooping Hawks that can reposition around the table. That gives you an excellent baseline of scoring. And combine all those attacks and all those rerolls, especially alongside the melee counterpunch units in the list, to deal some serious damage as well. Oftentimes some surprising damage from these styles of Eldar, which altogether gives you a pretty solid matchup into a wide variety of targets. Now, moving on, we have Clement Cordeau, who was running Death Guard. Now, Death Guard aren't the highest scoring army in the game, but they are good at scoring a pretty solid baseline. They can dominate the center of the table with their big, difficult to engage with bricks, and another thing that they do is give you an incredible option against aggressive melee armies. Blood Angels are very common right now, as well as armies like World Eaters, who can be a little bit of a spoiler. You can throw them into tough matchups, try to get first turn and just blow somebody out with Angron getting a turn 1 charge, for example. Death Guard give you a good answer to that because they get access to File Blight Spawns, which give these huge Death Guard Plague Marine bricks fights first and makes them extremely difficult to engage with by enemy melee attacks. Clement's list was running 2 Biologus Putrefiers as well as 2 Foul Blight Spawns. Both of those could double attach thanks to the Fetid Virion ability into 2 Plague Marine units, and we had 2 units of 10 Plague Marines, so those were getting enhanced critical hits from the Biologus Putrefiers as well as fights first from the Foul Blight Spawn. That means that anything that touches those Plague Marines is going to get hit by 4 heavy Plague weapons, potentially with sustained 2 on 5-ups, as well as lethal hits, which is a death sentence for most units in the game. We also saw 2 Death Guard Rhinos to carry those guys around the table, 2 units of Death Guard Cultists, and 3 Fetid Bloatrones for a little bit of utility, 3 Plague Burst Crawlers to give the army a little bit of a tough backbone. That also gives you another set of fairly reliable indirect fire, which can be a spoiler for those other high scoring armies because you're again able to just knock out their utility units and independent characters and stuff like that without them having any recourse. Last but certainly not least, we saw 2 War Dog Brigands in the list. These guys are commonly played in Death Guard because Death Guard have very good synergy with allied units. Death Guard usually debuff enemies by putting them in their own offensive auras, and War Dog Brigands can benefit from those debuffs, which is great. You can also potentially, if you're choosing the Contagion to reduce armor saving characteristics, you can essentially give yourself +1 AP on everybody who is in Contagion range. So you're giving enemy units -1 toughness, -1 save, and then the War Dog Brigands get +1 save targeting the closest enemy. So they're essentially getting to the AP2 on those Avenger Chain Cannons, which in and of itself is good. Demon Breast Spears go to AP6. Probably unnecessary, but it does punch through a Land Raider in cover, which is kind of nice. Now that moves us on to some of the more maneuverable armies in the composition. These armies are incredibly good at just getting a high score almost regardless of the matchup that they're playing in because they're going to be able to teleport around the table, get themselves into useful positions to score secondaries, and potentially even get themselves secret missions at the end of the game. This included Arnaud Allot, who we actually talked about in the WTC War Masters, the singles event. He made the top 4 cut with his Necron army, playing, I believe, what is the exact same build. So this guy already put up his results in the singles event and also took those skills to the team event as well. And that's actually a pretty common refrain for this French team. A lot of these players scored very highly on the WTC War Masters singles GT, including Olivier Weiss, who actually won the GT with an insane Black Templars list that we'll cover again later on, but I also talked about earlier this week. So not only is Team France bringing a pretty effective composition, but they are also bringing some incredibly skilled players. Definitely helps their chances. Allot was running a Hypercrypt Legion, allowing his units to enter Strategic Reserve at the end of his opponent's turn, and then use Cosmic Precision to 3-inch Deep Strike back on the table, potentially on objectives or in the enemy deployment zone. This included a Hexmark Destroyer with Dimensional Overseer to allow more units to hyperphase, Imhotep the Stormlord to generate some additional CP for the army, a Locust Lord with a Risen Tyrant, as well as a Translocation Overlord and a Scorpek Lord. That Locust Lord could jump into a unit of 3 Locust Heavy Destroyers. These guys had Enminic Exterminators, so they're getting their sustained hits on 5-ups with the attached Locust Lord, and reroll to hits when they arrive on the battlefield thanks to a Risen Tyrant, giving them an enormous number of additional hits from those shots. They were also backed up by another unit of 2 Locust Heavy Destroyers, but we didn't have an attachment for them, And there was a Triarch Stalker in the list as well, so you can actually strip cover from enemies to then let the AP1 of those Enmitic Exterminators go to town on enemy infantry. Following that up, we had a unit of Immortals, as well as 2 units of Deathmarks and a unit of Flayed Ones to just act as utility units, a big unit of 10 Lich Guard for the Overlord to jump into, a unit of 6 Scorpek Destroyers for the Scorpek Lord to jump into, alongside a follow-up unit of 3 Scorpek Destroyers and 3 individual Locust Heavy Destroyers to act as those scoring units. Last but certainly not least, we had a Monolith, which could be bringing those melee units to the fight using its portal, and then use Dimensional Corridor to allow the melee units like the Lich Guard or the Scorpek Destroyers to charge after arriving. This gives you an essentially automatic charge. I have talked about this list before. It is very effective. It has a lot of melee counterpunch, which is really interesting to see in a Hypercrypt Legion list, but it's definitely using the Monolith's portal to the best of its ability. Not to mention the fact that it has tons of these tiny utility units, 4 units of 5 light infantry, a lot of whom have deep strike, alongside 3 Locust Destroyers that can wander around the table, complete secondaries, screen out enemies, and just generally allow the army to score tons and tons of points passively. Now we see a similar style of list being brought over by Yohann Teston, who is running Grey Knights. Grey Knights have a similar effect. Obviously, they can teleport around the table using their teleport shunt and use prognosticated arrival to arrive 3 inches away from enemies. It's essentially the same deal that Necrons have. The additional benefit that Grey Knights have is that they also are forcing opponents to consider the counterattack, because Mists of Deimos can absolutely ruin their day. So in some armies, especially against armies that are focused on melee bricks that have to move up close to an army in order to engage with them, Grey Knights can be an absolute nightmare because you can simply Mist of Deimos away in response to any of those melee units coming at you. If you don't have very specific counters to Mists of Deimos, it can be problematic for you, which can again throw an additional criterion to the opponent's team during the pairing process, which can potentially make them mess up and put the Grey Knights into a good position. Teston was running a Brotherhood Librarian with the Sigil of Exigence, plus a second Brotherhood Librarian, as well as Caldor Drago. We had 2 Brotherhood Terminator squads to carry 2 of those guys around, probably the Sigil of Exigence guy, and a 10 model Brotherhood Terminator squad for Caldor Drago. That would leave us 1 Brotherhood Librarian by himself, but he is just fine on his own because he's able to teleport in using prognosticated arrival to annoying places on the table, use his Vortex of Doom, and still perform an action, so you can get some mortal wounds out of that dude, on top of also completing secondaries. We then also had 3 strike squads to give the army a lot of scouting units and a lot of objective secure, especially if you can manipulate the pairing process to put Grey Knights into a matchup where the opponent cannot redeploy around the table. The ability for strike squads to hold objectives and then later on in the game teleport off of those objectives, lock them under your control, and then not have to worry about them forever can mean that Grey Knights in some instances, especially missions that have a lot of objectives on the table, missions like the Ritual or missions using hidden supplies, for example, Grey Knights can farm a huge number of passive primary objective points just by locking in 2 or 3 objectives every turn and then leaving the table. We also then had 3 Nemesis Dread Knights to follow out the rest of the list, giving it a good brick of fast melee and strong shooting, especially against enemy heavy infantry or light vehicles. The Nemesis Dread Knights can clear those out fairly effectively. This is a pretty well-rounded Grey Knights list. Some of the better performing Grey Knights lists in the tournament ran all of the Nemesis Dread Knights, running 5 or 6 Nemesis Dread Knights, but this list is a little bit more well-rounded. That does make it slightly better at scoring, since the Brotherhood Terminators, especially the Caldor Drago unit, can be a huge disruptive force to the opponent's team. They can drop in, use Caldor Drago's additional +3 to charge when they deep strike, get into an objective. They're OC3 on the Brotherhood Terminators. Even if they lose some casualties, the Narthessium is going to bring them back in the unit, and if the opponent comes back to attack them, they can Mist of Deimos away, rapid ingress, and then do it again later on in the turn, all the while regenerating models back to the unit. They're very difficult to deal with. They aren't the highest damage output. They do have lethal hits and some pretty solid melee profiles, but not the most insane melee attacks in the world. But their ability to get on target every time is super useful. And every time they do that, they are probably docking your opponent 5 to 10 points on primary. Now, moving on to the armies that were situated to just kill the opponent and get enormously high scores. Now, I don't want to say that these were high scores in terms of the raw victory point score. These are instead high scores in that differential scoring phase. So these armies were trying to get 20-0 victories just by tabling people, essentially, in order to push the French team into the lead over their opponent. So while the other armies largely went for draws or at worst small point losses, these armies were trying to get 20 points and would not settle for any less. And they were very effective at it. Alexandre Sacco was running Thousand Suns. This is a very heavy character focused Thousand Suns list, as most Thousand Suns lists are, but this one was running 3 disc sorcerers. That gives the list a little bit of additional control over fast enemy units. The disc sorcerers can slow down enemy units on hit with their arcane fire, and with 3 of them in the list wandering around, you're going to be able to board control quite a bit. We also saw 3 Infernal Masters, one with Arcane Vortex and one with Umbralific Crystal, as well as Magnus the Red, and a standard sorcerer. That's the unshootable sorcerer who can't be targeted by ranged attacks outside 18 inches while he's leading a unit, with Lord of Forbidden Lore to allow him to duplicate stratagems. We then saw 4 units of Rubric Marines. 3 of those would attach into the Infernal Masters, 1 would attach with the Thousand Suns Sorcerer, 5 models apiece in those, 1 Rhino to give the list a little bit of an out against indirect fire. As I talked about before, one potential counter to lists like these are lists like that Aeldari one that was running a ton of Dark Reapers. Those Dark Reapers could be a nightmare for styles of lists like these that are running multiple lone characters. They're not lone operatives, they're just guys on the table. So if those Infernal Masters are caught out in the open, or if the Disc Sorcerers are caught out in the open, a bunch of indirect fire attacks can just peel those guys out. So the Rhino gives you a little bit of defense against that. You lose Cabal points, but you protect your units, and you can use the Rhino to extend your movement a little bit, which is also good. We also then saw a Mutalith Vortex Beast to extend the range of rituals that potentially allows you to get multiple Doom Bolts at 36 inches, which can certainly help. Mutalith Vortex Beast is also just a good profile in and of himself. We saw 2 units of Thousand Suns Cultists for some forward operation and CP regeneration, because they do give up CP when they die, and a Zangor Enlightened unit for scoring as well. Ultimately, pretty standard Thousand Suns list, but that extra focus on characters, especially because the team format allows the list to potentially dodge matchups that can kill those characters really quickly. There are some really heavy indirect fire focused lists like Astra Militarum, for example, if they're still running artillery, that can be very problematic for Thousand Suns, especially if they have all of these independent characters running around the table. The ability in the team format to dodge those matchups, get this matchup into a opponent that can't deal with all of these tiny characters and rubric units running around the table, and you get a 20-0 victory.
Editing Trevi here. I think it's also important to note that the WTC did not use the August 5th update that changed how indirect fire weapons interact with the torrent keyword. You can no longer use torrent and indirect fire together at the same time, so you can't use Warp Sight to fire all the flamers from these Exalted Disc Sorcerers and Infernal Masters through walls and things like that anymore. You could at the WTC, which is why we saw probably all 6 of those guys in the list. I have a whole video about those changes if you want more information.
Now, Matt Bonnet was also trying to accomplish a similar thing. He was running Chaos Space Marines in Renegade Raiders with a hugely aggressive Renegade Raiders detachment. This included a Dark Commune with Mark of the Hound that gives the entire unit Scout, and he was attaching into an Accursed Cultist squad. Accursed Cultists have Scout naturally, but awkwardly their attached Dark Communes do not. So as soon as you attach a Dark Commune to the unit, they can no longer make a Scout move, because all models in the unit have to have the Scout ability for that Scout move to trigger. So the Mark of the Hound allows that Dark Commune unit to move forward at the beginning of the game, whereas the other units are going to have to stand still. That gives one Dark Commune the ability to really push up the table and potentially block the opponent into their deployment zone and prevent them from maneuvering around. You can then follow up with the additional 2 Dark Communes to flood the table with these resilient bodies that can also hit fairly hard, especially with that +1 AP when targeting enemies on objectives. We then had a Master of Executions, 2 Cultists mobs, as well as 4 units of Legionaries, a unit of Possessed, and a bunch of vehicles, 2 Predator Destructors and 2 Chaos Rhinos, with a single Nurgling squad to either screen out enemy infiltrators that could potentially block that Mark of the Hound unit from moving up the table, or act as utility themselves if they don't need to operate in that capacity. This list has a lot of board control, and it did get a ton of huge wins. Locking its opponents out of being able to fight was a big deal. I think it was probably less focused on the raw damage output available to Renegade Raiders, but it was focused very heavily on getting those high scores, and those high scores gave it one of the most impressive results on the team. Matt Bonnet actually came out of the gate swinging with 4 20-0 victories at the beginning of the event. He did get some smaller victories and 1 loss in the finals game, but the list was undeniably effective with its ability to control the table and get those huge wins. Now we see a kind of similar build out of Nicolas Seguier. who was running Astra Militarum. Nikolai was running a Militarum command squad alongside a platoon command squad, Lord Sor Leontis and Ursula Creed. We did have a bunch of Catachan Jungle Fighters units, so potentially could attach the command squad as well as Lord Solar onto one of those Jungle Fighter units to give him their Master Vox, but the other units do have Scout baked in, and we did have a couple of dedicated transports in the list, a Chimera and a Torox, that could embark those models and get Scout themselves because they're dedicated transports. So kind of similar to the Chaos Space Marine build, this build also has a lot of forward presence, with those two transports filled with 20 models scouting up the middle of the table to body block the opponent's movement. From there, we also had 18 Bullgrins to absolutely dominate the center of the table. They're extremely difficult to kill, they don't really die very quickly from ranged attacks, and they are a bulwark against enemy melee units trying to come in and fight the tanks of the list. Those tanks included a Basilisk and an Earthshaker carriage battery alongside 2 Rogaldorn battle tanks backed up by a Scout Sentinel. Last but certainly not least, we also had a Tempestus Scion squad for that Tempestus command squad to jump into. That allows the unit to get orders when they arrive from reserve, and the Tempestor in the unit gives them sustained hits as well. Given the fact that they get rerolls targeting enemies on objectives, they can score a lot of hits targeting units that are holding down objectives, and you always have to screen out the potential of that unit parachuting down and shooting your backline objective holders. The command squad makes the unit incredibly good at clipping out 5 Space Marines or Scouts or whatever is holding your backline objective, and that command squad can just kill it and take that territory for themselves. So they can operate as a utility unit, but you also always have to be screening them out to prevent them from getting the drops on those isolated objectives. This list and the Chaos Space Marine list, it seems like operate fairly similarly, although this list obviously is backing up the mid-board control offered by those transports, Catachan Jungle Fighters, and the 18 Bullgrin in the list, with this hugely powerful both direct and indirect fire shooting from the Basilisks, as well as those enormous Rogaldorn battle tanks that can just dominate the middle of the board if protected by the Bullgrin units. And this army was also incredibly effective. All these players that we're talking about in this section had incredible results. Nikolai dropped a single game over the course of the event, took 3 19-1 wins as well as a 20-0 win. Did get one more middling win, 13-7, and went down in one game, 6-14. Now, last but certainly not least, we'll talk about a list that I already covered earlier this week. Olivier Weiss was running Black Templars. Now, he actually won the singles event with this Black Templars list and also did incredibly well in the team format. While this is another list that is trying to just dominate these objectives and score these huge wins and block out the opponent's army from being able to compete, Olivier actually did not drop a game, had no losses on his record, did get one 10-10 draw, but otherwise everything else was a victory in the team format, and he did also get that #1 spot in the singles format with the same list. This was a Righteous Crusaders list running a Castellan with 10 Hauser's Bones to potentially give his unit a 5+ Feel No Pain when upholding the honor of the Emperor. We also had a standard Chaplain Grimaldus, who can duplicate that 5-up Feel No Pain or give his unit advanced charge. Also very, very good. Speed him up a little bit. High Marshal Helbrecht, as well as a Combi Weapon Lieutenant to act as utility. He was backed up by 2 units of Scouts as well to jump around the table and score some points. And speaking of scoring points, there were 100 Primaris Crusaders in this list. Just that's it. There were 5 units and 20. Let's go! We had units for the Castellan, the Chaplain, Grimaldus, and Helbrecht to all jump into. The Castellan and Grimaldus' unit could potentially benefit from those defensive buffs, so you have 40 wounds with a potential 5+ Feel No Pain. You're also backing that up with Armor of Contempt and Devout Push to run them around the table, and they represent a ludicrous amount of damage. Each of those models has 5 chainsword attacks that also then gets buffed by attached characters or by the Templar vow that they're currently swearing, which can compound when buffed by characters like High Marshal Helbrecht, who allows them to critical on 5s. Not to mention the fact that they also scout and can represent 40 OC, so they can take the middle of the table and just dominate all the primary objectives, and there's really not that much that you can do to stop them. Again, I already talked about this list on my video over on Monday, and Olivier was just playing the same version in the team format and did incredibly well, as I mentioned, in that format as well as the singles format. So with that, those are the 8 players that comprised Team France. They were able to go undefeated with only a single draw and their record in round 5. Otherwise, they won the other 6 of their 7 games, and that included taking down Portugal in round 1, Wales in the second round, Finland in round 3, a close game against England in round 4. That was an 88-72 result, fairly close to a draw with that one. Round 5 did end up being that draw against Sweden. That was 82-78 in favor of France. You do have to have a 5-point buffer between the two teams in order for the round to be counted as a win. Simply having a higher raw differential score score is not quite enough. You have to beat them by a margin in order to take the win. But France was still ahead in terms of score at the end of that round. Round 6 was a bit of a blowout against Australia, 106 to 54 points. And that brought them against USA in the finals. They were able to take down in a close game. Now, if you're wanting to watch the WTC, there were 2 English streams there at the event. Both Wargames Live and Tabletop Live, friends of the channel, were at the event live streaming. Please go give those guys a subscription, because getting all the way out there to Belgium and covering this event must have been an expensive proposition for both of these channels. I really appreciate that they were able to go out and create that content for us. So please go check out their channels and show them some love. I will drop links to them in the video description. I should mention as well that Glasshammer Gaming was also there as an English live stream, and there were a ton of live streams for other games or for coverage in other languages. You can find a whole list of them on the WTC website. I will drop a link in the video description. But that is the team composition that allowed France to win the WTC 2024. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about these lists and the strategy France is using to win their rounds. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.